Hello, friends, and welcome to my today's lecture, that is the themes in of modern poetry by Wallace Stevens. In my last few lectures, I had spoken about Wallace Stevens, his earlier poems like Anecdote of the Jar, the various themes that were dealt in it, and also the summary of the poetry of modern poetry by Wallace Stevens. Today I'll be talking about the themes that Stevens deals with in his poem of modern poetry. Now we see that various themes have been dealt with or talked about by Wallace Stevens in his poem of modern poetry. Some major themes that he talks about are old poetry versus modern poetry, meaning amid chaos, the human mind, ordinary people, sympathy and emotional peace, and realism in poetry. Now I'll be explaining these various themes and talking about them in a little detail. Now, old poetry versus modern poetry. When we talk about the two various kinds of poetry, now the title that has been kept of the poem of modern poetry, it has been kept with a special reason. And the very first few lines of the poem give clues as to the importance of differentiating this modern poetry, that is the poetry of the 20th century, from what came before that. Now, Stevens says that it was much easier for the earlier poets to actually, in quotes, find meaning because the scene was set. It repeated what was in the script, unquote. Now, this means that, though somewhat dismissively, before the 20th century, all the poets had just to follow the set norms or the set pattern, or we could say the established conventions and rules in order to make a good art. Now, as a part of the struggle of modern poets, then is that, in quotes, the theatre was changed, unquote. Because of the industrial growth, the development and growth of technology, and the havoc created by the world wars, the pastoral odes, and saccharine love sonnets, they did not have the same impact as they once had in the earlier times. Now, the poets must find new ways of finding the meaning and also giving us readers a way to make sense of the world, to, in quotes, construct a new stage, unquote, for their art. According to Stevens, the new way was basically to look within the mind itself and cultivate the human powers of perception as well as creativity. Now, the poem of modern poetry, it follows that technique of looking within the mind itself and then also creating that power of creativity in man. But at the same time, it steps into a more outward looking mode temporarily, and it is a bit more socially conscious. The poet must actually frankly assess the real world around him, and he must speak to the real people's real life experiences. Another theme that Stevens deals with in his poem of modern poetry is meaning amid chaos. The main purpose of poetry, according to this poem, is to find meaning and order out of chaos, and also provide the readers with something true and something correct to which they can hold on. Now, and this meaning which will be searched from the chaos may come in different forms, and it should also respond to the audience. Now, Stevens very explicitly he states that sometimes the poem needs to tell the audience, in quotes, exactly that which it wants to hear, unquote. Now, the process of making meaning is also very well described in the poem, and this poem is like a musician. The simile and the metaphors that are used in the poem, it's also like the poem is like a musician whose instrument gives sudden rightness and clarity to whatever sounds that pass around it or pass through it. Or we could also say that poetry can take the dark and confusing mess of the world and also give it some meaning. Now, as is mentioned or quoted in the poem, it must be the finding of satisfaction, unquote, which is told to us towards the end of the poem. Now, it is also worth noting that in the phrase a satisfaction, the word a here means that the satisfaction that the poetry offers is not going to be universal. Rather, it can offer something that is unique and also valuable to each person. Now, the remaining more themes of the human mind and ordinary people, sympathy and emotional peace, and also realism in poetry, I'll be describing in my next lecture. Till then, goodbye and thank you, friends.